And welcome everyone to a March Madness Men's Basketball Selection Committee chat. I'm Andy Katz, pleased to be joined by Arthur Johnson, Temple Athletic Director and a member of the Men's Basketball Selection Committee. And Arthur, I've been talking to your peers among the 12 on this esteemed group. And first off, I just want to know, where did your love of college basketball come from?
It's ESPN. Obviously, growing up in Georgia at that time in the mid 80s to the time I graduated from high school in 88, basketball was huge. Obviously, you saw a lot of the Big East basketball, the ACC basketball. And then when I went to school at Georgia, continued to follow it and just been a part of it. I loved the game. Grew up with Charlie Ward, so I had a really good friend who obviously played, had success. While it was more on the gridiron, he did have success in basketball. Those of us who played AAU basketball with him and then played in high school and all of that during those periods, we were not surprised that he was able to play in the NBA. He was always a little different from, when people are different, you realize it early. So.
As you got into the other side, the non-athlete side, the professional side, the administrative side, at what point did you realize this committee is really one of the most prestigious, if not, and I'm biased here, I think the most prestigious in the NCAA?
Well, even as a young administrator, even before moving to this side, you knew that this was a very important committee because the tournament is so big. I mean, the tournament captivates a whole country when March hits, and that, the March Madness moniker or the name that it's gathered, people gather around and people are interested in it, whether they watch college basketball day in and day out. It is something that's there. And then you hear the stories through the years. Obviously, they get a lot of attention on Selection Sunday, maybe a day or two afterwards, but then that focus turns to those games. And those games captivate everyone.
You've had a pretty diverse background at different parts of the country, high-level Division I. How much does that help when you get on the committee that you've worked in different leagues, seen different scheduling models, if you will, of how hard it is to schedule at different stops, and the strength of a conference versus maybe, you might need to do better in a non-conference in terms of your scheduling. How much has that helped, your overall sort of knowledge base as you got onto the committee?
It's been very helpful. I go back to my time when I was at Texas in the early 2000s, where we would go to a lot of the games. And I tell people all the time, I would watch Oklahoma and Kelvin Sampson battle with Rick Barnes and the teams. And we would, my wife and I at that time, we didn't have any kids, so we'd go to the Big 12 tournament. And so you'd see those wars. And then we were able to be in San Antonio when Texas was able to beat Michigan State to go to the Final Four. So you're following it and you're around it. But it goes back to even when I was at Georgia, when we had Alex Kessler and the team that won the SEC championship in 1990. And you had, Chris Jackson coming in there. You had Shaq coming in there. You had the Kentucky teams and the great players. Jamal Mashburn, now to see his son here, watching him play, following during all of that time, it just gave me a different perspective. When I went back to Texas from 2014 until when I left, being in the Big 12, obviously the Big 12 basketball at that time was just really tough, seeing that brand, seeing how they do it. In the brief period that I was in Chapel Hill, I got to see ACC basketball up front and really close. Also, when I was in college, I'd go over and watch the ACC games with Kenny Anderson and Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech, Kenny Anderson, you had Dennis and Brian, the big three in that team, to watch them. Although being a Georgia graduate, you are a Georgia student. My best friend growing up and in college, Sean Jones, was at Georgia Tech. So when they had a big game, some nights I'd be over there at games, sleep in his room until 6 a.m, wake up, drive back to Athens. But you just watched, a Kenny Anderson versus North Carolina, or you watch Duke, North Carolina. And just watching it and understanding it, knowing that great basketball is played everywhere. At sometimes some conferences are going to be stronger depending on what's happening year in, year out. You know, some conferences are going to have great coaches, but I also realize winning in conference is really hard because people see each other year in and year out. And then even when they're prepping for another game, they're seeing something on a team that they may play later that they might put a note down by. They might put this note. Players see each other. So winning in conference is a whole lot harder than winning in non-conference.
Everyone comes in with their own sort of idea of what's important to them, but it's a collective vote. It's not one vote that's over any others. And there's obviously protocols and procedures to follow. But what are aspects of the selection and seeding process for you that, you know, are important that you would emphasize when you go into the meetings?
Well, the first thing is, and the most obvious one is head to head. So you try to look at that, but you also try to study the metrics, try to understand their non-conference schedule, their conference schedule. Obviously, we always talk about, okay, who did you play? How did you do? And how did you perform in that game? Trying to understand that. We also have to look at what types of injuries may have impacted a game, or was player availability. And even now, getting on the committee, you get more information about, are they playing in a high altitude or not? And just some of those things that you don't think about before, now you have to dig into it. Also had a chance to visit with some of the coaches that I know and some of the people that I know in the AAU grassroots world to ask them different questions about, okay, tell me about, you know, what should you be looking at, or how should you be looking at it? And then people who were previously on the committee, I had conversations with them and they made me feel a whole lot better, because it's overwhelming at first. And you're thinking, okay, am I going to get this right? And they said, well, it's your opinion, but you have to watch games. You have to pay attention, and then you determine what's important to you. For me, head to head, looking at the metrics, I'm really big on defense. How's your team defending? Because I know you're not going to make a lot of shots every night. If you got a lot of scores, do you have the ability to get a key stop when you need a stop? So looking at the different metrics or the different pieces when it comes to that is very important to me. And then being able to score.
So your colleagues have told me how difficult Saturday is. You know, the first part of the week can obviously sort of, you can fill out the obvious ones. I'm interested though, Sunday, when we have these championship games and you might have a bid stealer, you might have some other scenarios. How hard is it to create the alternative brackets just in case something happens?
Well, the first thing I'll say, they made it very clear, and I understood it for the first time last year being in the room, the importance of getting the seeding right. So making sure, you know, from 12 to 15 or 16, that seeding is right, because you want to be fair to the teams that are 2, 3, 4, 1. If you misseed somebody, you make the first game a lot harder for someone. So you have to know more about those teams and try to understand, you know, what their strengths and weaknesses are and put them in the right place. It's really tough because if you got a bid stealer that's in there, someone from that conference, if the favorite wins, and if they won the regular season and they're the favorite, they're known, you know, they may be seeded at 8 or 9. Well, if it's a Cinderella may be seeded a little later. Well, now that shifts everybody that you might have lined up behind that. And then just to go through that process, I can't get off of this call without really commending the committee and commending the NCAA leadership with Gavitt, Joanne, Warlock, all of them. The processes are so good, and their knowledge and the information that they're able to spit out to us and provide for us, and then to tell us how it's going to work. So when we went through selection orientation, They gave you a sense of how it was going to work, so it was not the first time, and you were not surprised by it. So that's a big piece that comes into play. But you really understand the magnitude of it. Even starting on Saturday night, it starts when you start thinking about that, and then obviously five games that can determine not only who's in the tournament, but how much your brackets might have to shift.
That's right. Big shout out to Dan Gavin, Joanne Scott, and Dave Warlock. Phenomenal job for not just the committee, but actually putting the entire tournament together. Arthur, really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you in Indianapolis.
All right. Thank you. Take care, my friend.